everyone. I'm Amadine Kastler.
And I'm Kastler Skjeseth.
And we're here from the Oslo-based architectural practice Kastler Skjeseth Architects. And we're going to talk to you today specifically about our work in heritage sites. And we're going to do that through the prism of the architectural drawing. So the way that we use surveys to uncover, let's say, lesser known or unknown aspects of a place. So drawing on what's there, which is the title of our lecture, is nothing new. And Bruno Latour tells us that to design is always to redesign, that there's always something there, something remedial.
Okay, so this is a very traditional Norwegian house. It is situated in one of the interior valleys of Norway, so it is as Norwegian as one can get from the 18th century approximately. This area is considered to have some kind of genus loci, or spirit of place, some inherent Norwegianness in it, according to the architectural historian Christian Norberg-Schultz. What is interesting, however, is that the notched log construction that you see here is most likely an import from Russia, whilst the decorative paints that you see on the logs, maybe some of you can identify what it is. It's not a plant that grows in Norway.
Can anyone guess? No?
Nope. It is actually the acanthus, which is a plant that only exists in Norway as ornament and not as, it doesn't grow in our climate. It obviously comes from here, from Greece, and it becomes architectural ornament here first. But as symbols travel so often in history of culture and gets repurposed, so the acanthus traveled through the world. It went from Greece via the Romans into European culture and then all the way up into this valley in Norway. And there it gets repurposed as something Norwegian.
It's also been repurposed by other cultures. Here you can see the American bald eagle making its way into the Corinthian order. So the acanthus in the Norwegian vernacular house shows us that the local does not necessarily spring out of one place, but it's rather a synthesis of complex networks and global and local impulses. And we as architects are equipped to draw these complexities. We do this using the survey, which is a way of measuring and quantifying, but it's also a powerful tool of communication. So using architectural drawings as instruments for uncovering, let's say, fallacies in places requires an approach to architecture that uses some detective work. So this is a quote from Irénée Skalbert, who was actually our teacher when we were at university. And he says that you look at things, you look under things and through things, and you're doing that because you're looking for signs of momentary resourcefulness. And it's communicating that resourcefulness that interests us.
So we work in this kind of triangle between teaching and research and practice. And we believe that that's a very beneficial form of working, so that it's one body of work. So we teach in Oslo, but also in London, and also on this island on the south coast of Norway. What you see here, this is the island of Lyngør. It's on the south coast of Norway, in the North Sea. It is a very interesting place. It's a historic place with very well-preserved buildings from the 19th century. And it's going through a change or some challenges. They're talking about a UNESCO World Heritage application for the place, and it's struggling with the kind of issues that you might struggle with some places here in Greece as well, where you see an upsurge in tourism replacing local industry, and the decline in permanent residencies and a sort of very seasonal-based tourism.
So the work that we've been doing in Lyngør for the last 5 years has, with colleagues and students, has culminated in what we describe as the island reader. And the reader is threefold for us. It's a reader, so the person there doing the survey. It's to read, so the act of reading, surveying, and gathering knowledge. And then it's the reader, which is an alternative archive of translations and drawings that we have built up over time. So in order to develop this body of work, we consider that research is not a separate exercise from propositional thinking. And we actually believe that surveying is inherently propositional by nature and part of design thinking. So the surveys that we draw, they work at 3 scales. They work at the scale of the territory with its building codes and its topography. They work at the scale of the building with its kind of tectonic construction. So we're architects, so we really look at the way things have been put together and try to learn from that. And then they work at the scale of the object, because objects tell us about inhabitation, and they have carefully constructed codes of conduct built into them.
Such as the picket fence, don't jump over it. So our method of work has been very much informed by being on site and being on this island since 2015, when we started the transformation of this house that you see here. This has also been the base for where we do our teaching and where the students stay on the island. It's a typical proponent of a local typology of houses. So it's called a Sørlandshus in Norwegian, the Southern Classical House. Now, most people will tell you that the Southern Classical House always looks like this, and that all new buildings should look like this. However, this type of building is constantly changing. It's a dynamic piece of architecture. They change it according to what materials they have and the trends of the time. So in the book, How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand, he talks about the concept of the vernacular. So the vernacular is, roughly speaking, the native language of a region. But Stuart Brand also attaches some terms to vernacular to describe it as the vulgar, the bearer of folk wisdoms, the common, and the widespread ordinary, and that which is beneath notice. Now, these are actually terms that we want to engage with as architects rather than avoid. The island is super interesting for many reasons. One is the historic reasons. It was an outer port, so it was a kind of point of contact between the interior of Norway, which was at the time a very remote and backwards place, and with kind of a connection point to Europe, to the trading routes of Europe. So it had this population of ship owners, of sailors. It was very international. These sailors, they traveled all over the world, and they brought the world back to Lyngør, to this remote place. And they did so very much like the way that this Acanthus travels, as the symbols travel. They brought pieces of the world back with them, and they put it on their buildings, such as this one, which is a piece of kind of oriental ornamentation that you'd put on your windows to signify that you had traveled to the Far East. So Lyngør has this strait, this piece of water, the sea, that goes through the village. And this was very much the kind of the highway of Norway back in those days. And much like the follies of Potemkin or the Strip in Las Vegas, the houses here really like put their fancy stuff towards the water. They're kind of winking at the passersby. The most expensive windows and the most expensive white paint would be on that side. What's interesting with this drawing, though, is that the student appropriated a form of drawing that is the kind of military maps from the 18th century. And he did that to try to convey that there is a kind of stylistic warfare going on in these contested waters.
Okay, so the maintenance of the white facades that Erlend has been talking about is an annual ritual. It's very important in Lyngør, and it's part of this changing of the guards that occurs at the end of a season. So when holiday guests leave, maintenance workers arrive. And that change is identified in this drawing through the erection of like a lot of temporary structures. And these temporary structures, what the student noticed is they fall completely outside of the very strict heritage codes and building codes that other buildings have to adhere to. So the whole character of the island is changed by this maintenance. And what it also identifies, which is really interesting, is the fact that over-maintenance can be as dangerous in a heritage site as under-maintenance. So every front of house has a back of house, and we think that these environments are essential to local heritage. They're lesser seen places, but they're the places where materials are stored and actually kept, and they're also the places where local caretaking takes place. This is a drawing by a student. It's an unfolded plan that identifies these places as areas of backyard heritage, where local individual citizens shape their everyday environments. Here you have a taxonomy, and we work a lot with different forms of drawing to describe different things. This taxonomy is looking at objects of maintenance. So again, those different scales of looking at things. So the objects of maintenance from garden sheds to fire hoses, they tell us about local tactics towards preservation. So it's always important to look very closely at the place that you're working. This is the local football field, and here it's a kind of lesser manicured environment. It's actually very derelict. We could have put a photo in. But the student describes it as a heterotopia, where there's a completely different type of biodiversity, different types of animals, different types of plants growing than in the very manicured gardens that they normally have on the island. And we think that these less manicured environments are of equal value to the houses that they maintain and facilitate. And these spaces are essential to social maintenance as well as diversity in a cultural landscape. During times of change, places of utility are often lost. So that's a major issue. And this drawing tries to use its ability to have a layering effect to describe this transformation. So essentially, you see objects of utility, like tools, being replaced with snorkels, for example. And the objects of utility that are kept for sentimental value. So you start to be able to identify cultural changes in a place through the drawings. These are the piers of Linger. So the piers of Linger, when you live on a rock in the sea, the piers are really important because they're the only access point. They are lock and key to the island, essentially. So you can imagine during a time when they're discussing UNESCO World Heritage status and a huge influx of visitors, the piers become really important local kind of control mechanisms. So not only are they pieces of infrastructure, but they're also pieces of local expression. So this is a scan that we did. We scan all places, and we worked with an archaeologist to do this, but we scanned the transient places and the in-between places because they talk about a kind of different character of the island that we think is really important and is actually being lost over time as privatization is coming in. So it's this ability to move everywhere. Speaking of privatization, this is a catalog of local objects that are used to identify the boundaries between properties. So as the island has been recognized more and more as a heritage site, picket fences, planters, and shrubs have sprung up everywhere. And that actually has a really big impact on the way that the character of the place. So in any context, there's not a singular way of building. And it's the kind of diversity of approaches that we find interesting. Here you can see generations of ad hoc constructions that have been built over time. And what's nice here, and going back to that quote from Elena Escarabeo, where you look through things, the architectural section allows you to really cut through and look at what's going on inside, how things are constructed, the relationship between construction and context.
So parallel to using the architectural drawing as such, we also employ the physical modeling. So we use this a lot with students. This one, for example, is a piece of an existing building, but obviously extracted from that building and abstracted somewhat. These are three-dimensional surveys of buildings, and they isolate key moments. So they depict a fragment, and we use that as a sort of didactic device to push the student projects forward, but also to teach the students something about the relationship between the construction that goes on here in the model and the context that you see in the drawings. When you work at scale 1 to 5, those of you who are architecture students or engineering students, you know that that's quite a detailed scale. So if you have to make a model of it, you have to identify the moment you want to make. You can't make the whole thing. It's going to be very big. So these models, they reveal something about the buildings because they are juxtapositions, they are transitions in the building, and they talk about combinations of materials that have come together over time. Such as this one. This is a corner of a house in Linger, and the weatherboard that you see on the left is an industrial product from the 1950s that they used for better maintenance of buildings. Whilst the vertical paneling on the right is the original paneling from the 1850s. Now, a lot of sort of tastemakers will tell you that the paneling on the right is the authentic, that's the real deal. And the stuff on the left is some crap they put on in the 50s. We want to kind of challenge those values in a way and look at things as that they're both authentic. So we use the detail very actively, and the reason why we do that, these are actually proposals for the island, also then expressed through the 1 to 5 physical model. We do that because as architects working in a heritage site and with an old building, we've identified that it's good to zoom in on a moment in a building, to look at where multiple authorships take place and try to solve those moments. So this is us on site, or Amandine on site, in the Doctor's Huset, which we did a renovation of. We showed you the picture earlier. We spent a lot of time on site, and we actually lived in the building throughout this very stormy autumn.
Yes.
And it taught us a lot about how the building lives, you know, how it is put together and how it's modular. When we started opening up the building, it's kind of a bit like a surgeon, you know. You open up and you try to see what's there. We identified that there's a lot of cuts and a lot of moves have been made in the building over time that are further proof of this adaptation, this continuous adaptation and this resourcefulness that happens. Actually, on this image, you can see that windows have been moved and filled in over time. We want to use this as a precedent when we work as architects. So we are the next author in this kind of palimpsest. So these cuts in the fabric were our incisions to allow for light, air, and people to flow more naturally in the building. So we modernized the building somewhat for its current users. We decided to leave those cuts exposed so that one can always read somehow the building. One can read the different authorship. So on the right, you can see the marks of the axe from the 1850s, and then you can see our incision, or the craftsman that we worked with that cut the logs and inserted this wedge to keep the structure stable. And then you see the paneling, the new paint on the left. So you get these moments of juxtaposition that are interesting to us. And there are plenty of cuts in the building, like this one from the 80s, where they put in sanitary facilities in the 80s. That's when they got toilets and showers. We thought first to tear this thing down because it sits quite awkwardly on the building. It doesn't quite work. But then we actually decided we should keep it. It's a part of the history of the building, and we should rather work with that cut that is there. So we translated it into a double height space, and we allowed those old textures to meet the new craftsmanship to keep telling the story of this building. The building is full of cuts in the different materials, through the stones, through the logs, and we did that to enable connections between rooms that were previously not connected. Now, this is the fireplace and the hearth. So the hearth is where you would cook and heat the building. So obviously in a freezing cold climate, that's quite important place. This one was completely obscured by services, by cables, by plasterboard and logs. But we know that the fireplace is a very driving element in the development of the Nordic house. It is extremely important. So our intervention was much about liberating that sheer mass of stone and brick and masonry and create this kind of new but old piece in the room as a kind of sculptural object that you could move around and could be the anchor of that space. We used cast iron plates to echo locally produced wood stoves that have been in production since the 18th century, that have these tableaux on them, these like vignettes and drawings cast into them. And we also reused the old bricks in the masonry that's dating back to the 17th century to recreate the baker oven, or at least the geometry of the baker oven in the new fireplace. So we believe that it's important when you work with these projects to establish a critical connection with tradition and through using certain familiar objects.
Okay, the work that we do is often about revealing complexity and difference rather than homogeneity. And we don't think that anybody, no two people perceive the same place in the same way. For example, these are memory loss drawings, which actually describe that kind of in-between space between reality and memory. This is a catalog of architectural copies, and this is the last drawing that we're going to show. It's a catalog of architectural copies that talk about how building elements have been translated through generations of buildings. So it's very hard to tell here which one is new and which one is old.
We're going to end on this image. These are pieces of ornament from our construction project that are being prepared, repaired, and repainted, and they're going to be put back on the house on this island in the North Sea. So those that are keen-eyed among you will recognize the kind of traveling ornaments, right? There's a certain Greek flavor to these objects. For us, this is interesting because these pieces, they were once timber, right? In the Greek temples were once timber. Then they were stone, and here they are timber once again. And for us, this is beautiful because they are pieces of Greece in form somewhat, but they're also pieces of Norway in material. But first and foremost, we consider them to be expressions of a kind of complex history of the world that we should embrace rather than avoid and simplify, especially in these times. So our work speaks about the local, about tradition, and about belonging to a place. But we try not to fall with that demarcation of us and them that occurs a lot these days. So we're seeking to develop ways of drawing on what's there, which is equally about local common matters and world relatedness.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.